Welcome to the Intrazone, a show about the Microsoft 365 Intelligent Intranet. I'm Mark Cashman, here with my co-host Chris, the ever-present on the end of this line, McNulty.
Thanks, Mark, and it's interesting. You said you're here? I'm looking around. Are you here?
I'm ever-present, Chris. You can hear me only in your mind.
Where's here for you today?
Here for me is Sammamish, Washington, just a click away from Redmond, Washington, home of Microsoft Corporation. But it is quite an empty campus. I actually saw a recent article where they showed a pretty wide shot of the empty campus. And I wouldn't say it was sad because at this point we're relatively used to it, but it brought a little nostalgia.
Well, here for me for today's broadcast is coming from Cannon Beach, Oregon. Since with remote work, you can be many locations, so we decided to come down here for the week. It's a place we've been before, and it's really great to come down the coast and get a little bit out of Washington. It's interesting. There are Intrazone followers who keep score and who show up online and have asked me about my various cross-country trips this summer. Since our last recording, yes, I have driven back and forth across this great country. It's really amazing to think that during a time where we're still under a relative shutdown, I've managed to accumulate 14,000 miles without setting foot on an airplane. But today, we're able to accumulate more wisdom without taking any further miles. We're going to be talking today with Shane Young, longtime friend of SharePoint and increasingly longtime friend of Power Apps. He's well known for his leadership at Power Apps 911, and Chris Kent, who is our Office 365 practice lead at DMI.
When you mentioned, that Shane and Chris have been around for quite some time, it really is great to see their leadership. They really aren't just, hey, look at all the cool things that I can do. They often turn it around and say, look at all the things you can do. I've kind of maybe weathered the storm so you don't have to, or hey, come along and weather the storm with me. But they truly are makers in their own right, which really prompted us to not only pick their brains, but to really pick apart, what does it mean to be a maker? We want to learn, and you'll hear from Chris and Shane both how they approach being a maker, whether they call it being a citizen developer or somebody who doesn't technically ever use Visual Studio, but maybe to some it looks like they do. We really want to explore the tools and their techniques and really pick apart what I think they hear a lot, which is, why do you do this? That ever-present question, why be a maker? I think a lot of times it's because, you don't maybe have the funding or the resources to hire somebody, and everybody likes to tinker a little bit, or for those that do, you can.
This week's episode is a great topic. I've heard Jeff Teeper mention many times, like in its early days, SharePoint was essentially a no-code business apps platform, if you think about it, right? The ability to rapidly start to stand up a combination of lists and libraries with workflows and forms, building the kind of distributed computing application that you probably only could have dreamed of 20 years ago. It's a really interesting time. Mark, I think our audience may be familiar, with some of our legacy tools in this space around InfoPath, and especially SharePoint-based workflow. Those tools are deprecated, and we deprecated them 4.5 years ago. I know recently something that we hopefully added a positive jolt to the community by signaling that, it's not our intention to keep these tools out there indefinitely. We have published a end-of-life notice for SharePoint 2010 workflows in Microsoft 365. Everything with on-prem stays the same. But we're also clearly indicating that SharePoint 2013 workflows are also on their way out. And as much as people want to focus on the end of things, this is really a good reason, if you haven't, had to look at some processes in a couple of years, to see what you can do to tinker, to build something new, to make something better. And Chris and Shane are definitely veterans of all of that.
A lot of the recent probably consternation, which, as you mentioned, now has been a couple of years, is people facing the reality that Microsoft, even willing and able to support technology for that 5 to 10 years as far as official support. But to then even think, what was life like 2 years ago, even a year ago, in our world, in our competitors' world, or just in any space that relies on tinkering and changing in terms of technology. When I see the name, a SharePoint 2010 workflow, still running or people still relying on it, I think, for one thing, that's awesome. I also think, boy, it really is time to look at updating that. And we know that there is pain that brings. We also know that there's a lot of benefits when you move off of it and you see not only can you replicate what you were trying to do, but there are a lot of things that you weren't able to do in that span of time. And now you can with Power Automate. Now you can with Power Apps. And now you can even further with the things that you'll hear Shane and Chris talk about, where you can even push the envelope a little bit, but stay within the comfort boundaries of not writing something so custom that it'll be hard to manage and maintain over time, especially if you think 10 years from now, where things change and how things change.
It is impressive that some technologies that were driven out, 10 plus years ago, that they are still relevant in the cloud. The fact that you can take something like SharePoint 2010 workflows, or InfoPath 2010 forms, or the first implementations of managed metadata service. Lots of these things were originally built to be, single tenant, locally run systems that ran on a server with, all the benefits and all the drawbacks thereof. And taking that code base and adapting it into the cloud, I think, there's an awful lot of behind the scenes work that never gets seen and never gets credited just to make those services run. But we do hear a lot from, hey, wouldn't that be great if there was a cloud-first version of workflows and a cloud-first version of forms? And the answer is there is. It's all tied to the Power Platform. And so, the advantages of having scaling and security and, ubiquitous no-code access, all those things are there, but they're different. We were not going to pretend that they're, identical to what you would have done before. If you've ever kind of gone from writing a blog post or an article with pen and paper, and then you lose the paper and you've got to recreate it electronically, the fact that you're using different tools sometimes leads your brain down different pathways as you're exploring and tinkering. And, maybe I can make this heading bigger, or maybe I want to add a button over there. I think it is an exciting and energizing time for us to be looking at all this.
I think so too. And I know that there is a span of people that are very happy within the boundaries of, I just want to do what I can do out of the box. Click, click, and I'm good. And I'll be very transparent. I often fit right into that mold. But there are also a lot of people, and I think this is where the magic starts to happen. Not only can you tinker and do some things, but you're not just tinkering. You're actually building what is it your team needs? What is it your solution actually needs without hiring an additional person or, spending a lot of time doing something. I know that I've benefited from some of the work that Chris has done. Chris Kent, I always benefit from Chris McNulty, where I literally went to the GitHub repository, grabbed probably 10 or 20 lines of JSON code that he had written. I had a great visual of what was going to happen when I applied it. In reading it, even not really ever being a coder, I could kind of see the little things I could tweak if I wanted a different color, a different font size, a different ordering. But I literally copy pasted, and the technology allows it where in this kind of modern era, it is not going to tank my application. It's not going to tank my site, certainly not going to tank the farm. And it opens up where Mark Cashman, non-coder extraordinaire, can absolutely accomplish and do something, with just a little bit of want to do it. So today you're going to hear a lot from Shane in this value of Power Apps, the realities of the past, and certainly how he's been moving forward, training people at Power Apps 911 and really showing people how that they can, crack open Power Apps and get done what they need to do. And Chris Kent from that perspective on lists. Lists, I always think Chris is building the feature before we build it. And then we catch up and then he keeps going. So a lot of excitement around lists, of course, with Microsoft lists. And the value of what Chris will share today applies directly to that and any list, of course, that you've ever created in the past. So are you ready to turn and hear a little bit more and learn some from Shane and Chris, the other Chris?
Absolutely. Let's bring them in.
So when you really want to learn how a maker's going to make, not just make applications, solutions, but to the end user, and of course to the person that hired them, or if they were asked to do this as a favor, they are going to bring the magic. And to one person that I know out in the community that holds this magic in their hands and processes it through into everything that he does with his customers. And obviously he shares a lot. He's an MVP, so he shares out to the community as well. I want to welcome to the show, Shane Young. Shane, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Mark. I feel like I have like a slight tear forming. That was like the most poetic intro I've ever had done. Thank you. That was heartwarming.
So tell us a little bit more about yourself. You know Power Apps really well. You're an MVP for just a couple of years, but love to know a little bit more about what got you into this maker world and just explain a little bit about what you and your company do.
Yeah, 15 years I have been an MVP, right? That's and I started way back in the beginning when SharePoint was just a wee little lass back in SharePoint 2001, 2003 days. And, and I grew with the platform and I loved everything about growing with the platform. And so I found myself, we went from SharePoint on-prem to SharePoint Online to one day I kind of woke up and was like, all right, I'm ready to do more, help my SharePoint people do more awesome things in SharePoint Online, because a lot of my skills were around infrastructure, connecting servers and SQL and nerdy things like that in reality have no place in the new online world. So I had to find a new way to drive some value, and I tripped over Power Apps at the right time. And that's kind of how I became a maker.
I think now Power Apps are now tripping over you because you're out front and you're probably looking behind your shoulder going, come on, guys, let's add some features here. Let's catch up a little bit. But I do want to pause here and just make a small note that our friend Chris Kent has just appeared. Chris, can I pull you directly into the conversation and welcome you where we've already just barely started with Shane Young?
Hi, everybody.
Alongside Shane Young, Power Apps extraordinaire expert is Chris Kent. Chris Kent, you're known in the community for focusing on a lot of things. I don't want to boil it down to such simple things, but I've always thought of you as somebody who can take a list and truly make it both your own and what it is that your customers require. But we've learned a little bit about who Shane is. Chris, can you give us a little sense of who you are, what you focus on, and some of the things that make you get up in the day and take charge?
So I'm Chris Kent. I live in Knoxville, Tennessee. We've got 3 kids. They've been at home with me for about 6 months and going to keep being at home with me. So good and bad there. But as far as what I do in the community, I'm heavily involved in the SharePoint Patterns and Practices group, or I guess I should say Microsoft 365 Patterns and Practices group now. And my primary focus is on list formatting. So that's the column formatting, the view formatting, both using fancy wizards and just editing the JSON directly. So that's a lot of what I do. But during the day, I'm a developer, do a lot of SharePoint framework and .NET and all sorts of fun stuff.
That's cool. We're framing this episode around Makers Make Magic, and the two of you represent the things that you can do beyond essentially what you get out of the box. And I again, don't want to too much simplify, but I think of you both as tech tinkerers, people that are willing to roll up their sleeves, take in the requirements or sometimes the nudges and suggestions that you get from your customers and, of course, partners that you work with, and then figure it out. And I'm proud to say Microsoft offers you some nice platform offerings, obviously apps like Power Apps and Power Automate, and then the notion of leveraging this web tech JSON into how you work with a database or a flat database like a list. As we dig in, I really want to understand the mind of a maker. Shane, you've moved from cows to dogs. What does that mean in a tinkerer world?
I don't know, Mark. That was a very unplanned transition, much like, the whole Shane's cows things was an unplanned world 15 years ago. The transition to dogs was really, I think, coincided with one of the things I found with the Power Apps space, and this kind of the world changing so much, right? I mean, we're on a podcast now instead of this used to be a blog post. But I've really tried to make a lot of headway in the YouTube world. I do, I've done hundreds of YouTube videos at this point. And as part of that, you need a persona. So obviously that's me being me, but then I need kind of a muse, someone to go against. And YouTube really frowns on using your kids as reference, right? Like Chris, I've got 2 kids. Mine have also been home for 6 or 7 years, I think, at this point. So I ended up going with Chewy, my 110-pound Labradoodle, as kind of my main character to go against. And so Chewy has actually become the mascot for Power Apps 911 as the star of the show. It's really sad for such a lazy dog.
So he probably is the brains behind the operation.
I mean, he definitely is the chief napping officer if you look at our website. So.
Well, I hope we can hear some snoring in the background or weird dreaming noises. Dogs, I know a lot make those great dreamy noises. Chris, I know if we can use that word, maker, you often represent yourself as Marty McFly, or a representation of you into the future coming back to save us in the present. I also want to map that to a previous job that you had that I am also a contributor to, but on the consumer side, the Regal Entertainment Group, which is maybe where that persona came from. Can you talk to us a little bit about just the solutions that you built maybe back in the day? I think that takes us back to 2010, but really now, the way that you approach being a maker today?
Yeah, I tend to, like a lot of makers, I live right on the edge of copyright violation. Right, way back, I used to work for Regal Entertainment Group, so that's the Regal Theaters, and I ran the business intelligence and SharePoint groups there, focusing a lot on, intranet style stuff, but also, campaigns. So back when you used to use your Crown Club points and all that, we did a lot of intelligence around that. And we surfaced all of that in SharePoint internally, and it was a lot of fun. But one of the best parts about that job when I stayed there so long was I got a movie pass, which allowed me to see up to 4 movies a day for free, which I used pretty heavily. In fact, one year, this is where I've got a pretty heavy focus on war horses or warrior horses. That comes out of back when I saw 100 movies in a year one year in theater.
Whoa.
I had a little movie blog site where I would review movies. And one of the movies I couldn't stand was it War Horse? So I decided it'd be better if it was called Horse War. And so I made an image, and then one day before doing a demo for the P&P calls, I realized I needed a demo site. So I just grabbed that old image and I put it up there, and that's where Warrior Horses and all that comes from.
I love it. That, to me, perfect both examples of why you are who you are and how you represent. So I think that's a great place to continue. I will selfishly let you both know that a lot of what we're focusing on for our audience is the role of SharePoint in the intelligent intranet. And with that, a main component is lists. Chris, I think this will be an easy one for you. Shane, I know that we'll be pulling a little bit of you don't always build against lists when you leverage and work with Power Apps. And I totally understand that. And I know there are a lot of scenarios where that completely makes sense. But I think going forward, I'll make some assumptions to the conversation around when working with data, usually lists for us, and that connection to make them look nicer and make them more functional. And of course, then to have it as a component that you can further customize forms or build your own mobile applications. But that's just setting the stage a little bit. I want to know, first starting with Shane, to just dig into the approach when you're thinking or working on solutions where lists are a component. And with Power Apps 911 leading that charge, kind of walk us through the approach of how you might commonly come across the needs of a customer and then working towards solution?
Sure. And the interesting thing I would say, Mark, is that SharePoint is the most popular data source for Power Apps, bar none. Like, I don't even have any hesitation that more of the apps that we've built have used Power App. More of the apps that we have built on Power Apps have used SharePoint as the back end. So it's really a great data source. You just have to understand a little bit about its limits. And so when I first approach these conversations, I kind of say, all right, there's 2 different ways we can go at this. We can either use Power Apps to extend the SharePoint experience. So if we want to go customize forms, add a Power App into our SharePoint site, go in and modify. So we're making SharePoint better by using Power Apps to kind of expose ourselves or to expose the data and work with the data. So that's one way you can go after it. The other side of the coin is that you want to build a standalone app. So you want to build a mobile app or a tablet app. Maybe it's an offline app. Maybe it's one for taking pictures and gathering data. It doesn't matter what, but oftentimes we'll see people gravitate towards SharePoint being the data side for that. So it's not about extending or using the data in SharePoint. It is just storing the data over there. And so in those cases, one of the things that we really like to think about is trying to simplify what we're doing on the SharePoint side if SharePoint's truly just going to be a data repository. So we end up using our primary columns, our text columns, number columns, and date columns. And we don't use a lot of the complex columns of SharePoint because they have additional mechanics that go with them. And if we're really just building the experience to all be app-based, we don't need those additional mechanics. So we often will not use those. But that's one of the ways that we can use SharePoint as a data source without overcomplicating our lives to just truly say, okay, in this scenario, it is a data source.
And if you have one common data source, we're talking about lists, but just in the notion of building a solution, you want to have one common data source no matter how people interact with that data. My assumption would be that, especially when you move into Power Apps, you could have a Power App be a tab in Teams. You could have a Power App be a SharePoint web part on a page. You could have it as a mobile application or to even beyond, just have it as its own application. Do you always think in terms of, I could store the data once, make the connection to it, design the application in the way that they want it, but then plug into all of those entry points relatively quickly if the solution required, sort of a web approach, a mobile approach, and something that was a little bit more embedded in a teamwork scenario?
Yeah, so Power Apps has the ability to build responsive apps, so apps that would kind of size those different pieces. I'll be honest, it's not Power Apps' strong point at this time. And so a lot of times what we find if we really get in with a customer, they have, a 90% use case is one of the different design surfaces you mentioned. We can expose it in other places, but we typically think first, all right, where are you really going to use this? And we build around that scenario.
Gotcha. So shift the conversation a little bit to, at least from my perspective on this conversation, Chris, your strength of speaking native JSON. And if you can do it verbally, I'd love to hear how JSON is spoken. Jokes aside, with that language on top of lists, you are really affecting the actual original, not just the data source, but the data design surface. But you're doing it without the requirement of going out to another app or presenting a form or whatnot. Can you speak a little bit to the types of scenarios where, a list is great, both for the data storage we were just talking about with Shane, and then some of the list views and some of the configurable conditional assets that you can influence a list on? Where does JSON come into play, and where do you see people asking you for help or want your work on top of that?
So I love lists. Long time ago, I started off as a SQL administrator and .NET developer, right? Going kind of hard, and the things were difficult, right? It took a lot of work to get just a spot where you could store data, and then when you wanted to actually surface it, it took a lot of work. And lists take all of that out of the equation, right? It's just really quick. You hit a little button. There's a nice little wizard. With the new list stuff, there's actual templates. They'll just go ahead and create all those columns for you, and you're off and running, right? You don't have to spend a ton of time learning how to do all this. In fact, you can just create a list, work with it, throw it away if you want, right? It's a really great surface to just work with. Now, JSON and all that stuff, my experience with this, I've been using lists in SharePoint for a long time. I used to do the SharePoint Designer and XSLT and all that. I loved client-side rendering with JS Link. I wrote a whole XSLT solution to try and make that even easier. Problem with that was it just wasn't really very approachable, right? The moment you opened that up, you really had to be a developer, even though you weren't really doing traditional developer type stuff. And when I love SharePoint Framework, when that came out, right, with extensions, we had the field customizer, which is great, and it's still really a good solution for a lot of things. But if you just want to turn a due date red when it's passed, that's a lot of overhead, and that's a lot of learning. And to be honest, most people aren't going to do that. You're not even going to contact your IT, organization to do that, because they don't have the time. They're busy doing all sorts of other stuff. And I love that JSON, you just put a few lines in there, some squigglies, some square brackets. It's red when you want it to be. And that's awesome, right? And now with some of these new kind of design mode wizards, you don't even have to write the JSON or even see it. And don't get me wrong, there's a lot of stuff you can do with the JSON. In fact, we've got a huge repository of over 100 samples as a part of Patterns of Practice. They're all free. In fact, several of them have been integrated into the new list templates themselves, which is really, really cool to see community work coming back into the product and being used all over the place. But that's where you can take that stuff. You can just copy and paste right out of GitHub. GitHub, I know, is a little scary when you're a maker, but it doesn't have to be. It's just a web page, and you can copy stuff, paste it, and then tweak it. To me, is exactly what a maker loves to do, right? Just tweak stuff. You got the drive, you got the passion. You use whatever tools you need to kind of mash it up, and that's a lot of fun.
Just listening to both of you, you just sort of influenced a little bit of how we might define a maker. I think one is the willingness to share and where you put your content. I'll be pretty upfront and honest. I think I may have broken copyright by copy pasting some of your JSON recently. I did reach out to you, Chris, to see if I could use it, but I was just trying to get a little bit nicer formatting in how I presented to my team a list of people, and we were trying to kind of pull from the gal, but also represent what they actually do, which sometimes is a moving target. So we had a unique column, but I stole some of your JSON. The other thing that you, I think, both said between the lines is when Microsoft or other companies that you work with maybe take on some of that used to be a little bit custom and now it's built into the product. The response from a maker is, and that's great. I love that, because then you just move to the next thing and maybe you don't have to build as much, or other people can do it even more quickly than going out to GitHub. It's just there in the product. But just that response, great. I love that it's there in the base product. That's great. And you really mean it. I think that's a great sign of a maker.
Yeah. And so one of the things I wanted to just jump on with Chris, right? Because it's interesting to know that I am in JSON royalties, purview right now. But, JSON, right? Because so just so you know, Chris, right? I have never written a line of C# in my life, right? I am not a developer. I'm just not. I've hated developers most of my life, but don't tell anybody, it's a secret. But so one of the challenges that I have in the Power Apps and Power Automate space is that, JSON is part of our world. If we're using like the HTTP GET actions to interact with SharePoint, for example, we have to look at JSON a lot. And it's really intimidating to a lot of the non-IT folks that I talk to. But I love that you explained it the same way that I like to try to explain, right? It's just text with some squiggly braces and some colons and some quote symbols. And in JSON itself, the word, it's just the hipster way of spelling JSON. It's not needing to be intimidating. So I love that you are also trying to inform people that, right? As makers, if you're like listening to this going, oh my God, I could never touch JSON. I thought the same thing, but it turns out that because of great people like Chris that make these samples, I can grab one of these samples and be like, oh, I can change that word from red to blue and not have to understand anything that's happening. So, Chris, I want as a maker myself, as a consumer of the JSON, the smart people like you build, I just wanted to say thank you, because I think you enable a lot of scenarios that you don't even know about.
I appreciate it. In fact, you should know, without getting too weird on here, I watch your videos all the time. So I do a lot of Power Apps. And I find these two worlds collide a lot, right? So I create a Power App, or I create, Power Automate Flow, slapping some JSON on there, right, to make the launches the Power Automate Flow, or it launches directly into like a deep link inside Power Apps.
Yeah.
It's a great use case, right? So it's not like these things are exclusive. In fact, I think makers you learn what you need to as you go, right? It doesn't have to be super complicated. You don't have to learn every step along the way, right, and get a certification or a degree in something. You watch what you need, right? You find the videos all over YouTube. I think Shane, you're about half of all the Power Up videos I've ever seen.
Yes, I'm sorry.
You do it. It's awesome.
I'll say one thing that I asked Shane that I think proves your point around YouTube. I guess on a day I woke up, I think I was just the stubborn product manager, and I reached out to Shane and I said, they added a space in between Power Apps. And he immediately wrote back and go, yeah, I know, but imagine all of the search engine optimization that I'll miss out on by adding that space. Is that right, Shane?
Yeah, Mark, good memory. Yeah, Mark politely, because Mark is one of the most polite people I know, politely said, hey, Shane, there's a space. I'm like, Mark, I know, but yeah, that's another important thing. And I think that's part of that maker mentality, right? Is correct. So Power Space Apps is the most correct, but the most practical, what people were looking for was Power Apps without the space. So I stayed where people were, not where I was supposed to be. And I do, there's been people that were not as polite as Mark that have kind of said inappropriate things. And I'm like, do you not think that a guy who owns a company called Power Apps 911 knows that there's a space between the two words?
Those are the people you give space to. Go ahead.
Yes.
Just take that. So besides the love between makers, which of course is, I think, important in terms of just, admiring, what others are providing to the community and leveraging it as well. And no shame in copy pasting or learning from others. But the next area I'd just like to address is just one that we don't want to hide from, and it's a decision that Microsoft has made, and it's something that we think we're communicating well, but you both will tell me otherwise. But we may need to get behind Chris's warhorse for this question, because I will step on a landmine, but I promise it won't explode. But I want to get your impressions on the move away from SharePoint 2010 workflows. And I think in my mind, this will take us into a nice conversation around Power Automate. But I first want to get from you both, or maybe Shane, I know specifically, this is an area that you have worked with a lot. But Chris, I don't want to undersell the importance of flow in your world as well. But tell me about the impact of this move away from supporting 2010 workflows, but where it really takes us to, for your customers, the maybe pain up front, but something that is providing them durable happiness going forward.
Mark, I think you summarized it perfectly. That is it, right? So we have been making, think about this. Microsoft has the audacity to tell us that we are going to stop being able to build SharePoint 2010 workflows. I don't know if you guys know this, but it is 2020. But no, so I don't think it's unreasonable that Microsoft is making this transition. And I know that there's a lot of people out there that are highly invested, 10 years of building workflows using SharePoint Designer 2013 at this point. There's a lot of stuff out there, but there's a lot of really, I don't want to say bad stuff, but let's say bad stuff anyway, that has been built over the years. And so I look at this as a great opportunity. SharePoint 2010 workflows are going away. You've probably got hundreds out there that have no purpose anyway, so getting those turned off shouldn't be an issue. And the ones that you really use, I think there's a chance to rebuild those and do better and do smarter things with them now in the Power Automate space. And I think it's a great opportunity for a lot of people to embrace the new platform. One of the biggest challenges in our SharePoint forever, as long as I can remember, is we're always kind of purposely locked in a box, right? We lived in a site collection, and that's where we lived. And all of these workflows lived in those site collections. With Power Automate now, we've got 300 plus different data connectors. We can connect to data no matter where it lives, on-prem, in the cloud, in the Microsoft ecosystem, out of the Microsoft ecosystem, in my car, right? My Tesla has an API we can connect to. All of these things are available. So this is a chance to go in, take a little pain, but rebuild your workflows in a way that makes sense in 2020, because it's probably not the same process as it was in 2010.
I just have to ask, with your Tesla, is the endpoint name of the API Musk related? Is it the Musk API?
No, believe it or not, he did not do anything clever in the API. The API is as boring as can be. It's very disappointing.
Well, Chris, do you have any perspectives? I do want to drill into a little bit about what does Power Automate bring to the table. We mentioned the connectors. I think there's a lot of fluidity in terms of bringing the workflow out of SharePoint and bringing it into an area where you can do a lot more work of calling in and out of different systems and different data sources. But that transition, let's lock in on just if you're, talking to a customer, and certainly we know we get the calls, the pain that 2010 workflows bring. If they're not working, they're harder to reproduce, harder to fix, and mapping that pain of moving from 2010 to Power Automate in terms of just getting off of old and moving to new. It is sort of like a pain ticket that we embrace with support, but then we think there's less pain over time. What does Power Automate, Chris, bring to you in a move away from the old and really, I think, adopting and appreciating the new once you're beyond the pain?
Yeah, and I would say I have a slightly less positive take on the loss of the 2010 workflows. Now, I totally agree with Shane. It's 2020, right? And it will continue to be 2020 for 3 or 4 years.
Yes.
But the idea, right, of Microsoft wanting to move away from that, I totally get that. I think the timeline was a little aggressive considering the amount of work, and there isn't a great one-for-one. Even 2010 to 2013 workflows, there wasn't always a one-for-one match when you tried to move between those. Mm-hmm. In terms of what features were supported, there were things that you still had to use 2010 workflows for. Now, I love Power Automate, Flow, and doing all of those kinds of things, right? You can always jump down to Azure Logic Apps if you're crazy. Not really crazy, but if you want to really get in there, you can, right? And that's awesome. And there's so many connectors. But I think the trade-off from here's what you can do to the world of licensing and other stuff that comes with Power Automate can be pretty tricky to navigate, especially when you're on a tight timeline and you're trying to take 400 2010 workflows that 3 administrators ago wrote. Still trying to figure out what they do. That's a tough ask of anybody. But all that said, there are so many things you could do now with Flow that maybe you could have tried to finagle with the 2010 workflow or 2013 workflow that you just is so much easier. And so coming out as a maker, right? So if you're brand new to it, or even if you're not brand new and you're just trying to figure out what can I do now, right? It's amazing. There's so many kind of recipes or templates that are available, right? You just think like, well, I kind of want to connect to this thing and then have this thing happen. Well, there's probably a template out there or pretty close. You can just adapt it. And that's awesome, right? So you can get really, really far without having to really dig into some of the more detailed, complicated stuff. And I'm not sure that was always true with the workflows. Just with SharePoint Designer, right? There were 400 windows you had to open up just to how to connect the list. Right. So there's a lot of good things there. There's still some areas where I think, believe it or not, we've still got some stuff that aren't quite the same as what we had with the workflows. Just a simple one is having to be able to see when I list out my flows that are running, being able to associate that with specific items and those kinds of ideas. But overall, it's a great place to be, a great place to be heading to. So if you haven't started that transition, well, TikTok.
Yeah, I certainly, on behalf of Microsoft, I hear you on the timeline. I know we're working on a number of fronts to mitigate, not to necessarily change the timelines, but to increase documentation, to increase support, for those that are truly blocked at a critical level. But I think also there is the notion of, at some point in time, it's a good thing for everybody, both for the durableness, the strength and capability of the flow that you're building, even if you migrated from one to the new, but also just for the sake of solutions and the experience of how you fetch data and then represent it to the end user. But I wanted to ask you both that question to get the real lens on it, both from what does it mean to your world in being a maker and leveraging that or growing things from the past. I bet a lot of your jobs are handed of, here's what we're doing today. And then you stare at it and you go, ooh, that's 5-10 years old. Okay. And that is not uncommon, I bet. So off of that, if I could bring us from 2010, not just workflows, but the year into maybe 2019, 2020, I have 2 questions for both of you, and it'll be pretty much back to back. I'd love to hear about a recent success, and I'd love to talk about failure and what you learned from it. And I bet what you then share with others based on not your failure, but the failure of something, a technology failure or implementation failure or something that we changed that you had to learn from. But starting with Shane, would you share a recent success moment, and describing enough to name a customer or the actual project, but just a little bit what you were trying to accomplish and what was the really great outcome of it?
Sure. So success moments are always interesting, because there's a lot of pain to get to it. It's the same as you often hear people talk about being overnight successes. In reality, right, no one ever talks about the 20 years that you did of prep to get to the point of being an overnight success. For me recently, I think a lot of my success, or one of my success stories, is this very large app I wrote for a financial institution, a bank. But what it was taking a very manual process to move customer information and account balances and account distributions, that type of stuff, from point A to point B. So it's not a traditional bank where you're just going in, hopping on your website and doing the thing. It's, you've got an advisor, you're working with them and they're moving things for you. And so this was a very simple process, right? At the end of the day, you're like, hey, I want to take person's money from this account, move it to this account, pay it via check, right? That sounds super simple, but it ended up being 40 screens worth of logic by the time that we actually sat down and broke down the whole project into what was really going on. What were all the rules? Because it turns out there's a bunch of tax rules and distribution rules. And while they've been doing it manually on paper forever, while people like to think of their manual process as being structured, in reality, a process isn't structured until you can do it in a repeatable fashion like this with a PC. And it was a very daunting problem at the end of the day that sounded super easy. And me and that customer, we probably spent 50 hours together on calls, tweaking this, tweaking that, just to try and get this process drilled down. Because not only was it, she had her process, but then she'd go put it in front of a user and they'd be like, oh, but if I do this 17 combination steps, it would fall apart. And that one was also fun because this customer had full premium Power Apps licenses, but they were pulling data out of SQL into this app to do a lot of the data lookups and out of their data warehouse. But then they were actually using SharePoint as the intermediary to then go down the process. So, it was like we're feeding data in from SQL. We are then processing it and then actually putting it into SharePoint to then have the workflow process continue for the payouts and stuff. And I just thought it was really kind of indicative of what we expect to see today, is this idea that you don't have one data source. You don't have one piece of information. Heck, I think it had probably 5 different SQL connections and probably 10 different SharePoint lists across 4 different site collections, all coming together to make it so the user could just, next, finish their way through this app.
And did you build in any office space, fractions of a pennies into your bank account?
Now, see, Mike, that's the type of thing that would get me in trouble if I admitted to.
Well, I assume your fax machine will make it by the end of this conversation.
Yes.
But that sounds like a great use case. And honestly, I think it is the reality of when there are so many people, a variety of process, maybe each individual does things a little bit differently. And of course, where the data lives, especially the data that you rely on to learn from, to highlight to other people to then move it down the chain. I think the notion of that there is only one and there will be only one is false. And the ability to connect them in a meaningful way to the point of being able to then repeat it in a way that there are fewer errors, that's a great success. Chris, any success that you would like to share? Again, don't have to name names. And if it's another Warhorse scenario, we'd love to hear it in the framing of a movie.
No, I don't have any successes with the Warhorses. But I can think of a success kind of related to formatting and everything else. But I was meeting with a client fairly recently. And, we were talking about a large overall solution, pretty big. But one of the things they kind of just mentioned in passing was they wish they'd had more budget in order to make this kind of little dashboard. And so I just asked for more detail on it. And what they wanted was just a spot. They had a small team, but they wanted to track candidates, right? So for interviews and everything else, and all they really wanted to show was details about that candidate, be able to see who's assigned what, see their status, but also have like the ability to start a couple of different flows they had, like a flow to scheduled meetings. They wanted to do that in such a way that, it happened based on what status they were in the process. They were under the impression this would be a huge, multi-week kind of initiative. They didn't have the budget for that. We were actually able to solve it in about 2 days with view formatting. Because they didn't have anything super complex, right? They just wanted to change how a list works. So we were able to use, the natural filtering of the views. And since you can apply view format to different ones, we had different views based if you were a manager or if you were an interviewer, right? And then we were able to launch those flows conditionally by just checking to see what the status was and then saying which button we should show. And they were super impressed. It actually helped us win the larger initiative. Just because we were able to show like, hey, we can use the tool you're already paying for. You don't need to do anything crazy here, right? And then it's super maintainable as well, right? If you want to change that shade of red later, that's not a problem, right? Just open up the JSON, do a find and replace on wherever that red is. There's no solution to deploy. They didn't have to go through change management. They didn't have to do anything crazy. It was a big win for them who thought they didn't have the budget to do something like that.
That is a success, and that it took, like I think Shane framed it, your smarts behind the scenes leading up to that moment, but then to implement it in 2 days and have that translate into them going, whoa, probably just a big learning curve for them that, removed a little bit of the, what is he doing, to translate it into this now art of the possible. I bet off of that, they wanted, additional tweaks to views and additional color, here and there. So let's turn the coin to the reality of the world that not everything is a success. And there are points of failures that teach you and, of course, hopefully don't make you look bad if it's something that we did or something that we didn't do that you have to work around. I'd love to know, when a maker hits a point of failure, what do you do to both fix it, but also to then probably create it into a best practice to share with others? Back to Shane, you have a point of failure that you learned from?
Oh, Mark, I've been thinking about this one for a long time. And so I'm going to go super cliche here. When it comes to being a maker, I think part of, as you're trying to kind of categorize and make up what a maker is, I think a part of it is it's about not letting failure win. The idea is that, it's very common when you're building something with Power Apps or Power Automate to run into, you can't do it. It fails. It doesn't work the way that you originally set out to do. You're like, hey, I want to do it and I want to do it this way. And you get to the end and it's like, oh, that doesn't work. So the people that are not good at being makers go, womp, womp. All right, Power Apps is terrible. I can't do that. And in reality, what it always is the case is if you can go back to the beginning and think about, all right, how could I solve this problem differently? How could I still need to start here. I still need to end here. The path I took didn't work. How do I reset and think about how do I do this, approach the same thing from a different way? I am undefeated so far with figuring out a way to make the Power Platform solve the problem. It wasn't the first way. It might be the second way I came up with. I can't think of one where I've not been able to find the answer. I just had to reboot and think about the same problem with a different perspective.
The failure, I think, to your point, is going to happen. You can't avoid it. And that the tools are there to adapt to what you're trying to accomplish, whether it's because you don't know exactly how to accomplish it and you're going to figure that out, or something just technically doesn't work, so you have to figure that out. I don't think that's cliche at all. It sounds like a great definition of a maker, and that you hit that often. That is not just one time. I bet that happens. It happens probably often.
Oh, it's a daily thing. And the idea that you just don't know what you don't know. So until my customers, they will come to me with designs, like Chris, I do a lot of consulting, and they will come to me like, here is screen by screen exactly what I want our app to be. I'm like, okay, great, right? But I can tell you that 100% of the time that somebody has handed me one of those designs, in the end, it might look 50% like that because they built the design based on what they knew, which was all the information they had, which is what they're supposed to do. But until I can start touching it and showing them, hey, it can do this. Hey, we can just format this. That I don't know what I don't know really just drives a lot of the outcomes here. And so getting to learning more has always been the key to being a successful maker.
Yeah, I'll take that. Transition to Chris. I will tell you my one single point of failure with JSON, besides just not being an expert in it, is I have been over the last 2 or 3 years trying to create a JSON Voorhees joke based on trying to make that pun work, and I just can't figure out how to make Friday the 13th funny with JSON. But
that's weird because normally murder references are hilarious.
Yeah, well, I'm just not credible enough to know the punchline. I have to learn from you. How can I make that joke work? But truly, joking aside, and you come back to me when you've got that joke working, truly in production, what points of failures have you come across and learned from, shared with others that you would highlight here?
Before I do, I'd like to say, I think I saw Shane, correct me if I'm wrong, I saw you in Cincinnati a few years ago to SharePoint Saturday, where you used that Tesla API. You turned on the car, and then it wouldn't turn off. There was some disconnect with the API, and I thought that was one of the funniest things. You did one in front of a live audience, right? Of course, I think I was dressed as a cockroach at the time. They had a whole Halloween-type theme, and some of us were in costume. So I don't have a lot to speak on there. So maybe that's my big mistake, was dressing as a cockroach. But, I thought it was hilarious. You recovered extremely well. It was great, actually, to see the behind-the-scenes. Things don't always work, right? And see you actually troubleshooting some of that. Anyway, that's an aside. As far as errors I've made, none.
You're perfect.
So, at the same time, a lot of times I think you can be too precious about a tool. And as a maker, you get kind of your favorite tools you use. List formatting is obviously one I like to use a lot. And it's not like you need to know all the tools, but it's helpful to be aware of them. When to jump from one to the other, right? So I can think of an example of I agreed to look into list formatting to get the rating columns. I was like, oh, no problem. Surely I can get the counts of ratings back, right? And we do some of that stuff. We'll just turn it on. I realize it's a little trickier on communication sites than team sites. You got to activate a feature, but you can do it. When I finally got into it, I realized that the individual column types that come back are very specific, and they're not supported because there's a white list of supported column types. And even though ratings is just a number, it comes back as a ratings type column. And so realized I had jumped in a little over my head on some of that. I just didn't know that. And I was just so dead set on using list formatting for it that I didn't even realize, the ratings column already meets what they want, right? In fact, it's even better because it's going to be interactive and they can rate it. Pretty minor, but where I churned quite a bit because I was so focused on using a specific tool. But I kind of just forgot about what was available already out of the box and what would meet their needs.
Yeah, I've heard you both say that once during the podcast, that there is a lot of technology that's in the platform, or to end users, it's, a click away. And I've been in a lot of executive meetings or just broader customer meetings where, you'll promote something or you'll talk about something that we've recently released or some value of some other component that is just the broader Microsoft 365 toolkit or portfolio, however you want to present it. And one person will turn to the other and say, do we have that? We should use that. And, and if you discover that on your own, or you promote that to someone else to take advantage of, to give them the keys to say, let's use OneDrive or let's connect with Power Apps, that's a great way to go. I think, those are both great discoveries. And I can imagine that you got a high rating after using the ratings column.
Nice. Yeah, and Chris, one of the things I thought was interesting there is you were kind of were making fun of me for screwing up, right? You just want to tell the world I messed up my demo. I think one of the pieces of advice I like to pass on to people is, as makers, making mistakes is part of the deal. So one of the things is I've, make all those darn YouTube videos. I don't know, I'm 5 or 6 million views in, so I think I've made a few. But as I've done that, I leave in mistakes, right? My videos are never perfect. They are never this perfect scripted robotic demo. And I think that that's one of the things that really help people identify with it, right? That's the thing that Chris remembers from meeting me, right? Was that I screwed up. And I think it's okay to, admit that you mess up this stuff and that you had to kind of work your way through it. So if you guys are ever trying to do more, to teach classes, to help other people learn, don't make them think that you always get it right on the first try. No one does. It's okay. Share your mistakes too. There's a lot of learning from that.
I 100% agree. And I think that is key to a lot of demo presentations. If it's too perfect, when you go back on Monday and you try and do it and you run into the first snag, you feel like a failure.
Yeah.
But as a maker, it's constant failure. And that's okay because it's part of the adventure, right? Figuring stuff out. I always appreciate seeing mess ups in demos, and then they just troubleshoot it, right? Or they move on. I think it's always great to know that you're not alone. This stuff's complicated. And it's fun, but that's all part of it.
You just reminded me of, in a pretty big, broad demo, it wasn't me giving it. It was a live demo and they hit an issue and you could hear from the back of the room. I'm probably not getting quite exactly right, but something to the effect of, you forgot a bracket. And they heard it, fortunately, added the bracket, boom, demo goes on and the community survives. Great advice and reality. Even if nobody admits it, that is a reality that we all hit. We're at that point of time where we want to make sure people can learn from you even more beyond this podcast and give a chance to each of you to identify best places for people to follow you. Certainly, Shane, we'd love to know if there's a shortcut to get to your YouTube channel. And Chris, the same. Starting with Shane, how can people learn more about you and soak up some of that goodness that you put out there?
Well, thank you for that. So out on YouTube, it's Shane Young Cloud. Or you can just basically go out and search for Power Apps anything, and it's real hard to not have my pretty little face pop up. And you get to see me, you get to watch me, screw up a lot, as Chris pointed out I'm good at. So yeah, there's definitely YouTube. Or one of the things that I did, because I have this extensive SharePoint background, like I said, 15 years. Oh, I'm so old. Is out, if you go to training.powerapps911.com, I actually created a class that is 100% about teaching SharePoint people Power Apps and Power Automate. So they learn just the things completely in the context of what their job really is. So I made a class that is just specifically that. It makes it a shorter class and better. And so that might be something you guys find helpful.
All right. Well, we'll put both those links in the show notes in addition to your Twitter feed, and people want to check in on you on LinkedIn. So Chris, where do people turn when they want to learn or go copy your GitHub JSON? What's the best way people can follow what you're doing and go get some of the stuff that you've put out there?
Yeah, so I do a demo on the SharePoint general development patterns and practices calls. It's every other Thursday. And there's also, there's a bunch of other calls too. There's one dedicated to SharePoint framework and so on. So I do a demo specifically on list formatting every 2 weeks. And all those get recorded and put onto YouTube as well. And you can find all of that. There's a whole playlist just of list formatting stuff. A ton of other content too. A lot of other tools and really neat stuff, including the GitHub repository with those 100+ samples we talked about. And the easiest way to get that is just to go to the PNP website, aka.ms/SPPNP. That's kind of the landing page for all this stuff. So you have everything from, SharePoint PowerShell and all the amazing stuff there, to the CLI, right down to PNP.js. So if you are a developer, there's a ton of tools. If you're not a developer, there's a ton of tools, right? So not just this list formatting, there's a lot of kind of pre-made samples and everything else you can use. So I contribute heavily there, along with a lot of other people. If you haven't had a chance, join one of those calls because they're interactive. You can always watch the recording on YouTube, and that's fine. It's kind of nice. You can 2 times it and hear us all talk like squirrels, which is awesome. But even better is to join the call because there's live chat with multiple people answering questions, right? People directly from the engineering team are on there. And it's a great way to really find out what's happening and what's coming and what to pay attention to.
So we will put all of that in the show notes, and we're going to make the show notes a launching pad for all makers and sounds like a little bit developers as well, as a place to launch and learn a lot from both of you. But I personally want to thank you for your time today. On behalf of the community and, of course, for Microsoft, thank you for making the maker magic that you do. And I think most importantly, the willingness to share out. Thank you for your time, and thank you for all that you do.
Thank you very much.
Mark, I appreciate you having me. Like I said, I've been a huge fan for a really long time. When you sent the email asking me to be on, I got like so excited. Like I should play it cool. I should play it cool. No, just let me on the show, because I think you referred to yourself earlier as you're just kind of like that, the Cliff Notes version of everything that is going on in such a vastly changing, powerful ecosystem. The work you do here is magic, and so thank you.
Well, maybe in the world of podcasting, I will join the makerhood if you'll have me.
We'll take you.
Up next, frequently asked questions, or FAQs. We know this is one of everyone's favorite parts of the Intrazone. It's a chance for Mark and I, along with our guests, to review some information that we've been sharing based on user responses most frequently. And so we'd love to kind of start, Mark, by asking you, what's a question that you've been hearing a lot lately that you'd love to share and answer with this audience?
We have quite a release cadence for Microsoft Lists, and it's been rolling out now, parts and pieces. We started with the Lists Home, a lot of the new ready-made templates, and as of yesterday, we started on September 3rd to push out the Lists app in Teams. So my very current FAQ is people are asking me, I see the new Lists app in Teams, but I don't yet see the Lists app in my app launcher within Microsoft 365, and then some form of, am I missing something? Do I need to do something? And the answer is no. They certainly are built on the same list infrastructure, but the Lists app in Teams is a unique and self-contained app that you run within Teams. It does all the work to connect to SharePoint to create the list, but the experience is all in Teams. So it does not yet require and doesn't require the Lists app to appear in Microsoft 365. So the clarity there is if you don't see it, it just means that the app that you see in the app launcher for Microsoft 365 just hasn't been released. And to be real open where we're at, we are probably about a day to less than a week away of launching to full targeted release 100%, which means if you are a targeted release customer in any fashion, you should have it by end of next week, being just a few days after this podcast releases. And if you are not in targeted release, then you will still not see it in Microsoft 365, even if you start to see it as a list app in Teams. So they are separate. You're not missing anything. We are working on it, and rollout, as far as we've planned, is going really well. Chris, what is whether you're in the state of Washington, the state of Massachusetts, or the state of Oregon, what are you most hearing as a frequently asked question?
Apart from my chance to explain the Red Sox dismal performance, why are they losing so many games? And by the way, the hint there is you need starting pitching to win a game every once in a while. And this week's gratuitous sports reference. The question I've been getting a lot this week is a fairly esoteric one, but it's really relevant to looking at lists and especially security around lists. How many unique sets of permissions can you put into a list or a library? This question keeps coming up because going back to our heritage of being on premises, this number had been 5,000 at one point in time. But in the cloud, the answer is 50,000. So you can have 50,000 unique sets of permissions on items that in many cases means, you may have 1 million, 5 million, 10 million items in the list. It's how many unique sets of permissions can be there. And the answer to that is 50,000.
And just taking that one, I'm curious because there are always questions around list limits. And of course, we're always trying to address them based on what people want. But my question is a little bit more on if you know, how often does that come up as a true blocker?
It comes up rarely in the wild, I would say. But when it does come up, it's usually for something like, a really large organization where they're building a process for all of their employees to submit something to a common list. And in that common list, everyone has their own permission to the items that they're putting in. There's some master set of permissions where administrators can see everyone's responses, but each person can only see theirs. You see a lot of this in things like benefits or HR applications that are really reaching out across the whole organization. So that scenario tends to come up when you have at least 50,000 employees that you're building out those kinds of applications for. And so generally, if you're going to, there are other technologies that you could use if you're trying to build something out for that many individualized sets of permissions. However, it's much more common that you have, a team or a group where you may have 1 million items in the list, but they're all sharing the same permissions. It will be the same division, the same pool of people who have access to all the items out there with a couple of exceptions. And those deployments seldom run afoul of that 50,000 item permission list limit. It's something we still are watching. If you think about the theory of constraints, and we sit down with our service and capacity engineers running a massive cloud service, SharePoint, even inside of Microsoft 365, as listeners of the show can recall, Mark and I have visited Azure data centers where Microsoft 365 lives, and that's one sense of scale. But the capacity numbers that people like Zach Rosenfield and the rest of our team watch is something we always want to make sure that we can give our customers the best service. But when we raise a service level somewhere, that usually we need to make sure we have adequate capacity. So it is definitely something that we are looking at. If we see this start to come up as a constraint more often, we have a process for escalating those things. We do want to continuously push all the numbers higher. I do think there are some other capacity numbers that are more top of mind for us, though, right now.
The thing that you mentioned just around Zach and team, Zach Rosenfield, and to throw in one more sports reference, they literally are always trying to see where the hockey puck is going, and that the projections that they do on actual use across a lot of different metrics is 100% true. And I think we could rewind to the episode with Zach and find that out to be true. So great FAQ, of course, great sets of FAQs from Shane and Chris earlier, because I think we were picking their brain on lots of questions. And hopefully you've got a sense of, if you've had a recent frequent question like those, you've got now some great answers. Let's move on to events. There are 3 that Chris and I want to share with you. And the first one that I'll share is GlobalCon 3. This one came in 3 parts across a couple of months. The next one is September 8th through the 11th, which is part 3, which is really the main part of GlobalCon 3. There was a getting started day, then there was a Power Apps and Power Platform day for almost, I think, 24 to 48 hours. And now there's a multi-day GlobalCon, like they did before with GlobalCon 3. Lots of great speakers, very much a span of the globe of who and how they're logging in. If you have a question, you want to learn, you want to get trained, GlobalCon 3, September 8th through the 11th. And this is part 3, the big part of their overall conference.
So coming after that, it's nice to see that there are still Microsoft 365 Saturdays or SharePoint Saturdays happening around the world. One we do want to spotlight is coming up on September 19th. This one is based in India, but it's virtual. So ideally, from anywhere around the planet, you would be able to connect to this. So Microsoft 365 Saturday Gurgaon, I think I'm saying that correctly, is happening on September 19th, right before Ignite. This will run for 15 hours. There are multiple tracks for developers and for IT. Jeff Teeper and Vesa Juvonen, known to our audience from our SharePoint Patterns and Practices offerings, will be leading the event off, and longtime friend of the show and friend of SharePoint, Gokhan from Valo, will be delivering the keynote. The registration is available online. You can link to it through the SharePoint Saturday website at spsevents.org, and we'll put the specific registration form in the show notes. Now, this is all leading up to, virtual drum roll, please. Mark, take us away.
This one I think we can share because we now have just a little bit more information to share about Microsoft Ignite. This is a multi-day event, September 22nd through the 24th, so literally just around the corner. I know Chris is preparing for this, I'm preparing for this, and hundreds of other people are deep in the weeds of making sure that this will be a great event. And the newest piece of information that we want to share is registration is now open. This is billed as 48 hours of continuous content and live Q&A. You, yes you, will be immersed in key segments with Microsoft leaders. Hear from your tech heroes in the digital breakout sessions with live Q&A, technical workshops, one-on-one consultations, and much, much more. Chris, what else is the much, much more?
So we are adding, it seems, hour by hour, more opportunities for live engagement, for Ask the Expert sessions, for making sure that we have staff available alongside all of these events. If you've been to Ignite before, as much as we think that the sessions are the main event, and certainly those of us who present at live conferences love those, the part that I always find most engaging is what happens in between. You've just finished a presentation and 50 or 100 people just are gathering in the front asking questions, and sometimes they're asking them of the speakers and someone else in the audience can present those. Our events team is doing, I think, a bang-up job of making sure there are lots of opportunities for you to supplement kind of those mainline sessions that are being delivered throughout Ignite with opportunities to get that live dialogue going with things like Ask the Experts, with our virtual booth structures. It's going to be fun, much easier for people to attend than ever before. And by the time this podcast is reaching the air, you should be able to visit us and see kind of the nearly full event catalog.
Yeah, I can tell you, Ignite, again, I echo what Chris just said with the team that's developing and delivering what this will be and our role in it. And of course, what your role will be, which is to make it as good as you want. You want to attend a ton of sessions. You certainly can do that. You have a ton of questions. There'll be a place to ask anybody and everybody. And it's global. So everything is intended not to be on the US time zone, but everywhere. So there will be sessions that get repeated. There will be live experts across all the different time zones. There will be a lot of news and announcements. There's a lot of training. There's a lot from Microsoft. There's a lot from Microsoft MVPs. And like on and on, we've talked about before, Ignite is our biggest event. And because it's online, because it's virtual, doesn't change anything from the impact that we want it to have on you so that you can learn, so that you can connect, and of course, explore. And along with that, find those people that are having those same level of interest, whether they're the speakers, whether they're other attendees. And I think it'll be a really, really great experience. Even if you're virtual, spend the time that you want to learn, connect with those technologies, and of course, the people behind it that you're interested in.
Yeah, Ignite's always a lot of fun. Definitely worth your time also exploring what's happening in the community at large, because there are lots of ancillary events, taking the place of, what might have been some of the live receptions and live parties. Those things are going to be happening kind of around the clock, around the world. It's definitely something, Mark, I had a look at earlier today. I'm sure you know this. We're trying to figure out where we have sessions that are happening in North America time zones that are being repeated elsewhere, like, where I want to start dropping in to be able to ask questions and show up with other people's sessions. And like 8 p.m., sure, happy to do that. 3 a.m., well, it's a good thing we have staff in Europe who can cover a session.
You never know, Chris, with your track record of moving around the country, you never know which time zone you're going to be in.
I never know which time zone I am in. So, but things are calm. Things are very Pacific down here. See what I did?
Nice.
And we look forward to seeing all of you at Ignite. Well, once again, thank you for spending a solid hour with Mark and with me and with our guests here on the Intrazone. We really want to thank Shane and Chris for coming on and bringing their tips and insights forward for makers. We will put links to everything they talked about today into our show notes.
You can check out our show page at aka.ms/theintrazone for this show and, of course, all others so that you can hear and grab all those show links that we always talk about.
If you're curious about other Microsoft shows, check out aka.ms/Microsoft/podcasts or adoption.microsoft.com to find a new program to help you learn more and connect to our community.
You can email us at theinterzone@microsoft.com, or you can track us down on Twitter @SharePoint, @mcashman, and @cmcnulty2000.
Word of mouth is still the best way people learn about podcasts, especially the Intrazone. So if you're enjoying this show, help us help more people. Please share that SharePoint love and subscribe somewhere on the Pacific Coast or wherever you happen to get your podcasts.
We are your hosts, Mark Cashman and Chris McNulty, and you've been listening to The Intrazone, a show about the Microsoft 365 intelligent Maker's Gonna Make intranet.